Hello friends, welcome to Earth Vimarsh. In this series of videos, we are going to learn intermediate microeconomics. I'll be covering all the chapters of the microeconomics which are relevant. This will also help to the students with the ongoing subjects in their regular curriculum. So to begin with, I'll be starting with the first chapter, that is the market, wherein I'll be discussing first of all how to construct a model, then optimization and equilibrium concepts, then basics of demand and supply, then what is market equilibrium, then how do we go about allocation of resources in economics, then specifically talking about the kind of discrimination which is there in terms of allocation or pricing. Then we'll talk about efficiency concepts like the Pareto efficiency, and finally we'll be summarizing with the concepts of equilibrium. So welcome aboard, and I look forward to your active participation. So let's begin with chapter 1.
Now, to understand what is model or model building in economics, we are taking a small example of the market for apartments. So there are apartments available in two areas, one within a region which is very close to the university premises, which is marked with white color, then the other set of apartments which is lying in the gray shaded area of the figure, which is farther away from the university. So obviously, preference wise, maybe some student might want to get an apartment which is near to the university premises, and definitely they are going to cost more because they have their added advantages, and the ones which are farther away, they can be cheaper, right? But their price might depend on n number of other factors also. So we are assuming that the ones which are in the outer region, their price is driven by n number of factors which we don't know, okay? But for the internal, the ones which are there in the inner circle, so their prices are endogenous. What we mean by that is that their prices are fixed. Now, before we jump into like what is model and why I'm giving such an example, now basically a model is something which is a simplified representation of a reality. So we have this problem that there is a market for apartments near the university, and there are different issues in terms of allocation, like determining uh, who would be able to get which apartment or at what price, okay? Now before this is very integral to model building process also. So before we work on those questions, we need some simplifying assumptions, okay? So to make a model more simple and realistic, so first of all, we are assuming here in the example that we are talking about short run. Now what I mean by that, that the supply of the apartments, the number of apartments being offered, remains fixed during this period of time which we are talking about. So there cannot be any change in the capital or any kind of resource that the supplier of the apartments can offer more apartments, okay? Now first assumption that is that you have a fixed supply, then all apartments are same, so you cannot really make a difference between much difference between the apartments. So then those who don't get an apartment in the inner ring, they go to the outer ring. Now this we have assumed. Then price of apartment is at a fixed level, okay? So we have already assumed that the price is going to be fixed. Now given this, we are interested in answering through this model that what decides the price of an apartment, or what decides, or who decides, who will live in the inner ring or who will settle outside. Then what are the ways to allocate, and which way is best to go about this allocation. Now having this in mind, I would just like to highlight that these two terms, that endogenous and exogenous variables, which are very integral to model building process. So whatever we are considering comes from outside the model, whatever factors are out from our control or falling outside the model, like here we assume that prices of the outer ring apartments are not within our control, so they are going to be exogenous variables. Okay, and what is already given or within the model, okay, that is endogenous. Like in our case, inner ring apartments price is endogenous. Okay, so this is the key distinction. Now keeping this in mind, let's proceed further. Now when we talk about the key objective of problems in microeconomics or economics as a whole, we know that we are looking towards a scenario where we have scarcity of resources, so optimization automatically comes into picture. So fundamentally, if we have to draw classification or like what would be the guiding principles when we are dealing with problems, so broadly they will be under these three key heads, and primarily the first two are dominant. So first one is the optimization principle, which basically states that consumers and producers always tend to choose the best patterns if consumption I mean that they can afford. Okay, whenever they are taking a consumption or a production decision, be it a buyer or a seller or a consumer or a producer, so whatever decision they are taking, they always try to make a best choice possible. Okay, with the given set of information. So this is what the optimization principle states. Then what the equilibrium principle states, that the prices, they tend to adjust until the amount of people who are demanding of something is equal to that which is being supplied. So when everyone is optimizing, no one would be better off with a different choice. So this is something which I wanted to highlight. And finally, empiricism is also one of the key principle, wherein using data to find answers to interesting questions is underscored by that principle. Now let's shift our focus to the theme of demand curve, how it comes into picture. So as discussed in the previous example, that we are interested to look into the question that how many people would want to rent apartments at any particular price, be it in the inner circle or in the outer circle, how many people would want to go for availing these rental apartments. So how to decide, how much demand is there. Now to understand this, first of all we should know what we call as reservation price. Now what technically this means is the maximum willingness which a person has to pay for something, like in this case for the apartments. So a buyer, his maximum willingness to pay for apartments at any particular price, which he is willing to buy the apartment, the maximum price, okay, that we call his or her reservation price. So reservation price, in the figure we can see, for example, that if a person could only pay $500, only one apartment will be rented. Then if price is below $500 in such a way that it's greater than $490 but less than $500, so no apartment is going to be rented, because it is something which is integrally in value, right? You can have one apartment or two apartments, it's not like 1.5 or anything like that, right? So it works integrally quantity. So but at, if the price, say for example, at is at 490, all right, so two apartments can be rented, right? And so on with falling reservation price. Say for example a third customer comes and his reservation price is further down, okay, so more number of apartments can be afforded, right? So the willingness to buy, okay, to pay for something, the maximum price which a consumer is willing to pay is called his or her reservation price. And as a consequence, we can observe as price falls, more people are willing to rent apartments. That is, the demand is increasing. And also demand curve is smooth, as there are many people with slight variation in the reservation price. Like for example, one is at 499, other one is 498, 497, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, then again 490 and so on. Okay, so hence from this figure we can generate this plot, that is smooth downward sloping demand curve as summarized in figure 2 for the market for apartments. So this is our demand curve. Now let's move further. Now let's see what a supply curve is and how it comes into picture. Now from the example, if you recall that we had assumed that we are talking about short run and wherein our supply will remain fixed. Okay, so on the horizontal axis we can observe that our supply curve is vertical in the figure, which means basically that our supply is fixed at S. Only S amount of apartments are available for supply, nothing more than that is available. So this is what it highlights. And also the key assumption which is there is that the market which we are assuming is a competitive market, wherein you have independent sellers. So the people who were selling those apartment or offering them for rent, okay, in both inner and the outer circles, so they are independent, and they are offering their apartments in such a way that they try to make maximum price or maximum profit out of it. Okay, so they are trying to maximize their profit. This is one of their objective of the landlords, those who are selling, and that can be achieved only by offering highest market price, the one offering the apartment to the one who is willing to pay highest market price, right? So now assuming perfect information is available to the landlords, that is there is no information asymmetry, okay, and the prices in the inner apartment are same because of this assumption that everyone knows what the other person is offering, okay, among the sellers. So if every seller knows what other seller is offering, definitely to sell his or her apartment, they will always try to keep a price which is competitive to other person. And as a consequence, what happened, because of information symmetry across all the participants in the market, the sellers, the price being offered remains same across all the sellers in the inner circle. Then if ph and pl are offered, say for example ph high price and pl low price are offered, where buyer will be paying between ph and pl, okay, because only there it's a feasible region, right, between high and low. So that is the only point where both the parties will be better off, the one who is selling also and the one who is willing to buy also, right? So same equilibrium prices there. So note that, from this, that in short run our supply curve remains fixed, that is our factors which can bring a shift in the supply curve are constant. So the supply curve is vertical to y-axis, and also note that the supply curve can change depending on the time frame. In long run, alterations can be there. Now for the basic model which we had considered for this apartment market, now we are clear that how our demand curve looks like, that is downward sloping, and the supply curve which is vertical to the y-axis because of fixed supply in the short run. So now putting together the demand and supply, where we reach is the point of equilibrium, okay, that is p star in the figure, and the quantity of apartment, that is the number of apartments being rented at this price, is S, okay. So p star is the equilibrium price. So at price p star, each consumer is willing to pay at least p star, okay. Whosoever is willing to pay at least p star gets the apartment to rent, and each seller is able to rent the apartment at this particular price, but at any price which is lower than p star, okay, demand will exceed the supply curve, right? So there will be a rightward shift in the along the curve, not in the curve, shift in the curve. There will be a rightward movement in the demand along the curve. Notice there is a difference between the movement along, and there is a difference between when we say that demand curve is shifting. Along the curve, whenever we talk of, it is due to the factor that is price. Whenever alteration is price is going to be there, in price is going to be there, so your demand curve will be movement will be along the demand curve, okay. But when other factors, say for example your income is changing or any other factor other than price is changing, your demand curve will witness a shift. So at that time there will not be a movement along the curve. Many times this is one of a grave mistake which students do whenever they are trying to work on problems, okay. So yeah, so this p star is the equilibrium point, and then given that if a price lower than this is being offered, you have excess demand, right? So at least some landlords will have more renters, you can say, because if you are offering below the equilibrium, definitely people will demand more from you, okay. So that's going to remain the case, and at any price which is greater than p star, so I mean this is a case where you, I mean, have less buyers, right? People willingness to buy will go down eventually, because most of them will be having a reservation price, say for example at p star, because that is the equilibrium, right? So some apartments will remain vacant in this case, and hence there is an incentive to reduce the prices to attract more buyers. So again, what will happen? The prices will have to be slashed again to restore the equilibrium at p star. Now let's move further. Now, from the basic model which we have considered, we have observed that the equilibrium price was p star, and any price above that equilibrium level, if it's being offered by the seller, there is going to be a low demand, and as a consequence he is bound to reduce the prices. And in case there is going to be a price fall from the equilibrium level, that is apartments are available at a very cheap price or within the reservation price, so definitely high demand is going to be there. So that makes the market more competitive, right? But now let us see, I mean, taking this basic model, that how the equilibrium price behaves in different situations. Now let's talk about the comparative statics. So before getting into the example, so just to define what are comparative statics. So in comparative statics, basically what we are interested to compare is two equilibrium points, like the equilibrium which we discussed earlier. So say for example we are discussing two equilibriums, one at time t and other one at time t1 or t2, like that, okay. But we are not interested in the changes which took place in between t and t1 or t1 to t2, okay. So similarly, for example, in the figure, if you observe that when we are at equilibrium on s number of apartments, and corresponding to which the price is old p asterisk or p star, if we think of supply curve to shift rightward, that we are expecting that the supply is going to increase, okay. So what it will result in is quite obvious, right? That we are witnessing a new price p star or p asterisk which is lower than the old price at equilibrium. So the new equilibrium price will be lower than the previous equilibrium price if the supply is going to increase, right? This is very, I mean, obvious result. Now let's move on to the next case and make it more interesting with little complication. Now let us make the example little more complicated and interesting. Now consider that the sellers who were offering the apartments for rent, now they have decided to convert some of the apartments to condos, which is similar to, I mean, building only, I mean, with, you can think of little bit different arrangement of infrastructure, okay. Now what happens as a consequence of this? So one quite observation that you can make is that supply is definitely going to shrink. So as the supply is going to fall, so price will increase. But will it be the case? If you observe from the figure, so the shift in the supply curve from the old supply shift takes place to the new supply, okay, and the equilibrium price initially, which was at P asterisk or P star, and the quantity of apartment or number of apartment were at S prime, it shifts to new equilibrium, right, with same price and the quantity being reduced, that is S, right. The supply curve has shifted, but at the same time, this is what our intuition says, right, but at the same time we should also notice that people, those who were demanding the apartments, their demand would also have gone down, right, since some of them, who were renting apartments, now may decide to purchase the new condos which are being constructed, right. So once they switch to that, so definitely parallel shift is going to be there for the demand curve also. So as a consequence, both the curves are witnessing a shift. So the new equilibrium which is being restored stays at the same price. There is no increase in the price, rather the price remains same, but what happens is that the quantity has shifted, right, the quantity has gone down. So if demand and supply both shift to the left by same amount, so the equilibrium price, that is P asterisk or P star, it remains same. Now, given that this market, obviously in a competitive market, we have observed that how the allocation is taking place, or at what price the equilibrium is being reached, right. Now what other ways can we think of allocating the apartments? Let's try to understand with few cases. Now first of all, let's consider the case of a discriminating monopolist. Now who's a discriminating monopolist? So the key feature of a discriminating monopolist is that he is selling to the person or to the consumer who is having the highest reservation price or raising the highest bid in the market, okay. So the apartment will be offered to that buyer or the consumer, okay. Now different people will end up with paying up different prices, right. So in that sense it's discriminating, right. So each individual is ending up with a different price being paid for renting the apartment to the seller, from buying apartment from the seller. So now assuming that he knows that the reservation, what the reservation price of all buyers is, okay, the monopolist knows that what the reservation price of all buyers is, still each apartment would be rented to the person who was willing to pay the most for it, right. So in that sense it's discriminating. Now exactly, in terms of outcome, if we observe, exactly same people will get the apartments as in case of the market solution which we have seen in the previous example, right. So everyone who valued an apartment greater than P star, they will be getting in that similar fashion the allocation, right. Now let's switch to the second case, which will be that of ordinary monopolist. Now, what happens in case of an ordinary monopolist? First of all, let's understand who is an ordinary monopolist. So, say for example, a monopolist, he is, he is forcing to rent. He is being forced to rent all the apartments at same price. Okay, so definitely there is going to be a trade-off, and what trade-off will be there? If he chooses a low price, he will rent more apartments, but he may end up making less money than it if he sets a higher price, right. So in the figure you can observe that if D as a function of price, demand curve, okay, demand function, the number of apartments demanded at price P, it's being highlighted by that curve, okay, at DP. And then if the monopolist sells at price P, he will rent DP apartments, D as a function of P, right, at price P. Now the revenue earned from this will be price time quantity, right. Revenue is equal to price time quantity. So PDP, that is the area of the box which is there in the gray, will be the profit. Now to maximize the profit, monopolist will find it in his interest not to rent all the apartments, right, because obviously there is no point of renting all the apartments. Definitely he is motivated with the interest to mint more profit, so it's in his interest not to rent them all, right. So fewer apartments will be rented as an outcome, and each apartment will be rented at a higher price than the competitive market. So this will be the key outcome, that the price which is being offered here is higher than the competitive market. Now the third case which we are considering here is the rent control. Okay, now say for example the city decides to impose a maximum rent that can be charged for apartment. Say P max is the maximum rent which can be charged. Okay, so we suppose that the price P max is less than that of the equilibrium price in the competitive market, where the equilibrium was at P star. So the rent which is being charged, maximum rent which can be charged, is below that P star which you can see in the figure. Okay, if this is so, we would have a situation of excess demand, because any price below P star implies that there will be a shift along the demand curve, so resulting in a lower price, right? uh, which further implies that there are more people who are willing to buy the apartments at P max rather than there are apartments, rather than there are apartments available, right? So who will end up with the apartments? The question arises, right? So we don't have enough detail as of now, given what we have analyzed or have described so far in our model, right? So to answer that, what will happen if supply doesn't equal demand, right? So the answer to this depends on who has the most time to spend looking around. Who knows the current tenants who are offering, and so on. These factors can play an important role in figuring out this problem, right? And this is something which is outside the scope of a simple model which we have developed. So maybe that exact same people, okay, those who were trying to get the apartments earlier, they might end up getting apartment under rent control, uh, uh, who were there in the competitive market, right? So thinking of this is very extremely unlikely kind of thing, right? Because those who were there in the competitive market, right, they were being offered apartments at price P, right? But now if the demand is going to increase and the price definitely is the rent, maximum rent has also been lowered, right? So given the demand is going to increase, so it's very unlikely that they will be getting it, same people will be getting the apartment at this price. Now again the point rises, what is much more likely then? So what is more likely is that the people who were staying in the outer ring, they might end up in some of the inner ring apartments, and thus they can displace the people who would have been living there under the market system, that in the competitive market. Right now the people who were living outside the periphery, okay, the two circles which we have considered, the one which is near the university, the apartments which are near the university area, and the other outside the premises of university area in the outer ring. Now people from the outer ring, they might end up getting some apartments in the inner ring, right? And the ones, those who have been staying in the inner ring, they might be displaced. Okay, so this can be the case. So under rent control, the same number of apartments will be rented at the rent which is being controlled. So the prices here are regulated as were under the competitive price, so they'll just be rented to different people. So this is the key outcome which will be observed here. Now, having discussed these four cases of allocation, that is the market mechanism, the discriminating monopolist, then the ordinary monopolist, and the rent control based measures, now one might question that which is the best way for allocation, right? But when we are trying to think of that which way is best, we should at least have some criteria in hand to decide, right? That which way is best in terms of allocation of apartments. Now, before devising any criteria, it should be in such a way that both the supplier and the buyer, the producer and the consumer here, are taken into account, that is renter and the landlords. So answer to this, in terms of a criteria, comes from the concept offered by Wilfredo Pareto. This is one of the prominent contribution from him, which is called Pareto efficiency or economic efficiency. Now what does that mean? So you question yourself that can we make someone better off, or is it possible to have an allocation to make a person better off without making the other person worse off. Okay, now if there is a scope for allocation without making someone worse off, then Pareto improvement can be done. Okay, but if you cannot make anyone better off without making the other person worse off, then I mean the process is Pareto efficient already. Okay, so there is no more scope for allocation, that is already Pareto efficient. So now let's talk about one by one about these all four approaches which we have discussed, that which one is the best based on the Pareto efficiency criteria. Now let's start off with the market mechanism. So we have observed that in the market, when we were trying to look into the equilibrium, okay, so the people who were having the maximum reservation price in the inner ring, okay, so those people were the ones who were willing to pay more than the equilibrium price, right, for the apartments. Now, as they were the ones who were willing to pay the maximum price for staying in the inner ring apartments, so there was no further gains or no better alternative to allocate, right, uh, after giving the or allocating the apartments to them, right. So the outcome of the competitive market is Pareto efficient, because they already paid the price which was equivalent to their reservation price, or even more than the equilibrium price of the market, right. So you cannot make anyone else better off without making those people worse off, right. So this is already Pareto efficient allocation, right. So now next one is the discriminating monopolist case. Now the case of discriminating monopolist is Pareto efficient, but there is a difference between the market mechanisms Pareto efficient allocation and the kind of Pareto efficient allocation which we are witnessing here. So let us understand how. Now, in the case of discriminating monopolist, you know that the apartments are being assigned to exactly the same people who receive apartments in the competitive market, right. So under each system, everyone who was willing to pay more than the price P, right, for an apartment got an apartment, right. So discriminating monopolist generates a Pareto efficient outcome as well. But the point here to be noted is that although both the competitive markets and the discriminating monopolists generate Pareto efficient outcomes, in the sense that they were able to no further allocate the apartments, right. So they can result in quite different distribution of income. So certainly the consumers are much more worse off if we understand in case of discriminating monopolist than under competitive market. Why? Because you can see that the pricing being carried on in the discriminating monopolist case is definitely having a bias or a discrimination for each subsequent consumer who is coming to buy or rent the apartment, right. So it is only concerned the Pareto efficient, it is only concerned with the efficiency of the trade off or the trade which is taking place, and specifically sticking to the question that whether all the possible trades have been made or not. So these two scenarios or these two approaches have shown that they both tend to be Pareto efficient, but in case of discriminating monopolist, consumers are more worse off, and the distribution of income specifically, it tends to be very different, right, as compared to the market mechanism. So now let's move further with the other two allocations. Now the case of ordinary monopolist. Now, if we understand, as we have seen even in the previous example, that this situation is not Pareto efficient. How? Because all the apartments, if we observe, right, they will not in general be rented to the monopolist. But what happens is that he can increase his profits by renting apartment to someone who doesn't have one at any positive price, right. So there is some price at which both the monopolist and the renter must be better off. So as long as they both, the buyer and the seller in the exchange process, they don't change the price that everybody else pays, the other renters definitely they are just as well off as the others would be, right. So they have found Pareto improvement, right. So a way to make the parties better off without making anyone else worse off here is clearly highlighted here. So this is a case for Pareto inefficiency. So there is a scope for improving. So that's why it's the case of Pareto improvement. Now for the rent based control, again we observe that it's Pareto inefficient. Now how? Now say for example the individual staying inside, in the inner periphery of the circle near the university area. So their reservation price, say for example, is less than that of the reservation price of the people staying outside the periphery, the ones in the gray area which we discussed in the example. Okay, so if the reservation price of the people living in the outer periphery, okay, is more, definitely there is an incentive for trade off, right, exchange actually. So what can be done, that if for example for the inner person staying in the inner periphery, for example Mr. In stays in the inner circle, his reservation price is 300. If he is offered 400 rupees, he has an incentive to shift to the other apartment, maybe to the outer periphery as well, right? And a person who is willing to pay 500 as a reservation price, he also is at a better off position, because he is paying only 400 bucks to the person who is staying in the inner periphery, and is able to get an apartment in the inner circle, right? So any price above the reservation price of the person who is staying inside, that is above 300, will make him better off. Like we have assumed that, say for example 400 is being paid to him, okay, and any price below 500 to the person who is settling from outside and coming to the inner periphery to stay, that is Mr. Out, he's also better off paying any price less than $500, right? So this allocation is possible, and hence it's Pareto inefficient, because there is a scope for further allocation, right? So given this, now let's move on to the next part. Now, one might question that what happens in the long run. Now, so far what we have discussed, like the assumptions we had taken, that our supply curve remains fixed because resources and other factors, they all remain constant in short run, so you cannot increase the supply of the apartments and allied factors. But one might wonder that, okay, now having discussed this short run where the supply was fixed, what happens in the case of long run where the supply of apartments can change? Okay, now here a few points one should ponder over are like the key questions, I would say, that when supply is variable, how many apartments will be provided by various types of market institutions, okay, and what will be the monopolist's behavior or supply more or fewer apartments than a competitive market, then again it's testable. Then will rent control increase or decrease the equilibrium number of apartments? Then which institutions will provide a Pareto efficient number of apartments? And in order to answer all these questions, or questions which are in line with this, okay, we must develop more systematic or sophisticated and powerful tools for analyzing these issues. So in the subsequent chapters we will be working out on these lines to get answer to these questions, and understand that how in long run these dynamics take place, and how the shifts take place, and how our equilibrium moves or adjustments in the equilibrium take place. So let's move on to the summary of this chapter. Now to summarize the chapter, so we started off with building a simple model to explain that what is basically a model, that is simplified representation of the reality to explain a particular social phenomena. Then and is underlined by simplifying assumptions as well. Then we talked about the key principles which are to be adhered while dealing with any of the problem, that is based on optimization, equilibrium, and the empiricism. Then we talked about the demand curve and the supply curve, and finally we reached at the equilibrium price in a perfectly competitive market. Then we talked about comparing static equilibrium points to draw insights on the shift in the demand and the supply curves under the comparative statics. Then finally we talked about how to think of allocation, to evaluate which allocation is best or which way is best. So based on the criteria of Pareto efficiency, we looked into that. So thank you for your patience listening. So in the next chapter I'll be taking up budget constraints. So I request you all to refer to the Hal Varian book for this chapter, and in the subsequent chapters also we'll be referring to the same text. So it will really augment the learning process if you follow the book along with these lectures. Thank you for watching the video. If you like the content, please subscribe to our channel. Also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and visit earthvimarsh.com for regular updates and insights on the pressing policy issues. Thank you.